Good morning. I'm here today with Nazir Razak, who is currently the chairman of the ASEAN Business Advisory Council. Delighted to have you here, and I hear you're just coming from Washington.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Rorry, for having me.
Of course, my pleasure. I would love to talk to you a little bit about what you heard in Washington and how things are going with U.S. trade policy, but let's start at a broader level. You grew up in one of Malaysia's most notable political families. Your father was the second prime minister of Malaysia. Your brother was later prime minister. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how this influenced your journey to become a Malaysian business person, and particularly how it influenced your ideas about what Malaysia and ASEAN can do to promote better economic integration and development.
Thank you. Well, I've written a book about it.
Yes.
So I wrote a book called What's in a Name? And that kind of covers my story, as it were, growing up in a well-known family, the pluses and minuses, and so on. But so far as career is concerned, I think, my late father, who passed away when I was only 9 years old, influenced me, even though I didn't quite realize it, more by his reputation and what he stood for, and many of the things that he did. And one of his achievements was actually being a founder of ASEAN. If you know that in the mid-60s, there was a confrontation, we call it, between Malaysia and Indonesia. And part of the outcome of the peace negotiations was the decision to form ASEAN. So 5 nations at that time came together. And so my father was a signatory of the ASEAN Declaration in 1967. And he was also the person behind ZOPFAN, which was in the Kuala Lumpur Declaration of 1971, which declared that ASEAN wants to be a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality within the context of the Cold War then. But I think it's still very relevant to today. And I think, generally his career, how he lived his life, influenced how I went about my career as well. I keep telling people that my father had 2 legacies. There's the tangible legacy and the intangible. The tangible is what you see in terms of policies, in terms of buildings and so on and so forth. But the intangible is more important. The tangibles are, were relevant for his time, may not be relevant today. But the intangibles were his value system, how he looked at problems, what motivated him. So those were more important. I think I referred to them as I evolved in the Malaysian corporate sector. So I had a 30-year career in banking, and now, having retired from banking, I am in private equity, but also have this role as chair of the ASEAN private sector. And that's just, again, an opportunity to give back to ASEAN. And coincidentally, my career in banking was also about transforming a homegrown Malaysian banking franchise into what is today one of the leading banking groups across Southeast Asia.
Right. Tell me a little bit more about the values that you think are most important when you look at ASEAN's current opportunities and challenges. What do you think, things that you learned either from your father, from his career, or in your own experience, how would you approach these problems from a values basis?
I think one sort of driving values of my dad was about development, about the larger community above self. And I think that's also very relevant to ASEAN. I think, it's very clear to me that small countries like Malaysia should find solutions to collaborate, to bulk up as a region. And I think, ASEAN can only succeed if we find the right formula of collaborating between countries. And at the same time, ASEAN is constrained by the fact that, we have very different levels of economic progress. So the formula to forward ASEAN, to pursue integration of ASEAN, needs to be very different, especially when you compare to like the economic, like the EU.
Right.
So I keep saying that, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we thought that when we grow up, we want to be like the European Union. But actually today, we understand that, even some of the Europeans don't want to be like the European Union. We have to find the formula that works for our region.
Absolutely. And, you noted the challenges of different levels of development between ASEAN members, but also within each country. I think the process of globalization in some ways has privileged certain communities over others, has created more economic inequality in some ways. And yet, you're a huge proponent of further economic integration, as a mechanism to solve some of those challenges and address them. Can you tell us a little bit about how you think the ASEAN Business Advisory Council might be able to kind of create the momentum or the ideas, the policies in place to help address some of these challenges and create, a more level economic playing field that hopefully should lead to peace, stability, and ASEAN centrality, all of those good things that we want for the region?
Yeah, I think that if you look at the Malaysian development experience, it's always been very focused on inclusion. It's always been focused on fairness. And if you look at instruments of achieving that, we were unashamed about deploying the state in order to rebalance society. And I think at the larger ASEAN level also, it's very clear that ASEAN needs to be inclusive, as you say, between countries and within countries as well. So every time we come up with various projects and all that, we keep an eye on these things. So if you look at various integration projects, there's always a need to make sure that we have opt-outs, clauses, etc., for the less developed ASEAN countries.
I see.
So they can delay coming on board, for instance, given their level of development. And I think that's very fair. Within the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, we also have projects that we pursue every year, and many of them are very much in tune with the inclusion theme. Historically, we've had projects to support micro enterprises, for instance. And this year, one of our important projects, we have 12 key projects. One of them is around philanthropy. I truly believe that we need more corporate dollar in the philanthropy space in ASEAN. So we've done a study to look at every ASEAN country, the policies that there are, the regulations that there are with respect to philanthropy, and also how we can make it easier for philanthropy to happen cross-border.
Right.
And this comes from a time when running the bank, CIMB at that point in time, we were making a lot of money in Malaysia. Then we started operations in Laos. And then one of the first things I wanted to do is actually say, look, this is a community that's very behind and needs a lot of support. So we wanted to take some of our profits and make donations to the community in Laos, but we couldn't.
Really?
There were a lot of tax restrictions, etc.,
Sure.
for us to do cross-border philanthropy. So I think as we encourage the development of ASEAN multinationals, we must also encourage philanthropy. I think the corporate dollar is much more powerful in helping the underprivileged,
Right.
in terms of dollar and also other corporate or private sector resources. So I think it's a good thing to get more corporate money into that space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's probably more important than ever that corporations, individuals step up to look at and assess some of the problems in these communities and address them with financial resources. We know, for example, that the U.S. has pulled out of a lot of the aid space in Southeast Asia. And we see, the kind of tightening of state dollars across the board as countries are dealing with the effects or potential effects of tariffs imposed by the United States. I did want to ask a little bit about that. It does seem as though the U.S. In lots of ways has, through the policies of our current president, Donald Trump, is really trying to put a stop to the process of globalization at a time when many countries still rely on global supply chains, on geoeconomics, and markets overseas, including the U.S. market, in order to promote their own economic development. How do you think the countries of ASEAN can best deal with the United States pull out of the system of globalization? And can that economic integration continue to happen, or how will it be affected by these U.S. decisions?
Well, I think firstly, it's still very early days. The administration has a history of
reversing course.
Well, kind of pulling back,
sure,
and responding to markets, responding to voices, and so I don't think we know exactly where this will all end up.
Right.
Second point I make is, it is up to the American people how they want which way they want to go.
Right.
So we don't make a judgment on that. But the tariffs was shocking. The announcement of the reciprocal tariffs for many, many reasons. And it was difficult for us because as a regional bloc, because different countries were slapped with different levels of tariffs. And within that, also, we compete in terms of what we export to the US.
Right.
So there was, we wanted to deal with it as a bloc, but we couldn't because, different countries had different priorities. So in the end, I think what's happening is we're kind of helping each other in terms of principles and general advice in terms of where we think the US is. But each country had to deal with it individually. I think we also are concerned about beyond tariffs. Where does America stand with the rest of the world?
Right.
And the kind of direction that's coming from the leader of the free world, as it were. So one of the things we're having the ASEAN summit soon. I'm hoping that we get, clarity in terms of whether we stay the course on climate change, whether we stay the course on DEI. These are principles that, in the main, we adopted based on influence coming from the West, from the US, and whether we still agree with them, whether we want to stay the course. These are very, very important. And of course, there are long-term strategic questions about U.S. engagement. I mean, I'm heartened by the U.S. engagement in India-Pakistan,
right.
Because initially I think the rhetoric was that's not our problem,
right.
But they've come in and looked to have been very helpful in negotiating some de-escalation,
right.
at least in what's happening there, and that's very, very important because I think there will be many, many more such situations, and it's very important that the world's largest military force, the world's largest economy, remain engaged.
Right.
I hope that doesn't fundamentally change because I can imagine, in Southeast Asia, we have ASEAN, we all get along today. But there are border disputes that we've kind of set aside
sure.
in favor of working together and developing together. But, under the Philippines constitution, they still claim Sabah
right.
as part of the Philippines. There are border tensions between Cambodia and Vietnam, for instance. These things can rise to the surface, because of domestic politics, for instance. And I think, we do need some kind of external force to kind of, be there to set the tone in terms of, geopolitics.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate noting where the U.S. is making policy adjustments. And because I think there are a lot of, as you said, there are a lot of situations in the world that may seem external to the United States, but still affect U.S. interests. And I think that's the case with the current round of tensions in India and Pakistan. And it also could or would be the case if there were major escalations among ASEAN members, or even major escalations between China and some ASEAN members who also have these maritime territorial disputes that are ongoing and heat up with regularity. So it's nice to be reminded of that in the midst of a lot of seeming change in U.S. policy, that when the rubber meets the road, when the price hits the real economy, the U.S. can even sit down with China and nail out the terms of interim agreements that reduce some of the pressure, take the pressure off a little bit. I think that one area I'd love to explore with you a little bit is the ASEAN digital economy framework, which has been a real priority, I think, for the Malaysia chairmanship. Tell us a little about, what you think from your perspective this might achieve in practice if it were to be enacted this year.
Well, it's groundbreaking. It's a legally binding proposed agreement on the digital space. It focuses on 9 areas, including, digital payments, digital trade, cybersecurity, and so on. So it's wide-ranging. And I think the impact will be significant because you're really talking about collaboration in managing cybersecurity, for instance.
Right.
You're talking about agreements of how data can flow between countries. There's even a work stream on digital identification or common digital ID across the region. So it's exciting, and I've seen numbers, about how significant this could be in terms of doubling the digital economy in ASEAN and so on and so forth. So we don't need to go there, but just the basics of it is exciting, and I don't think there are good examples of these agreements. I think there's one between Japan and the US, but those are countries with similar interests and similar development levels.
Right.
But if you look at ASEAN, to be able to do it, we're in a country where, like Singapore, where internet penetration is almost 100%,
right.
To Myanmar, where it's sub 40%.
Sure.
And Laos as well. So that will be amazing, and for that reason also, we set it as a priority. But it's a tall order to be able to complete that agreement this year.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about the challenges of coming to the terms of that agreement. Is it, obviously the major benefit of the agreement is that it could help level out perhaps or enhance some of the economies where digital services are less prominent. But is that also the major barrier to getting it across the line? Or do you feel like there are other kind of challenges that this type of agreement faces as, yes, perhaps a first of its kind?
Well, there's always that challenge of the different levels of development. And so, if you come from a less developed country, you look at it and say, okay, but what does this mean for our national interests?
Right.
Whether given this freedom, you're suddenly going to get huge super technology corporations or digital banks from Singapore and dominating the region and so on. So you've got to build in those safeguards in the interests of smaller countries, and that's always the most difficult part of ASEAN. Two is there's always the relative issue. which is that sometimes the best kind of regional deals don't get through simply because whilst everybody gain, I can't stand the fact that someone gains so much more. Things just don't get done because of that.
Right.
That's really unfortunate. So these are the things that have to be dealt with as we go through this. And of course, there's always vested interest in every country that one needs to navigate through the political stream.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's it's a common challenge across all trade agreements. Where do you think ASEAN kind of productivity, profitability, stability could be most unlocked right now? Is it in the digital space? Is there more to do in manufacturing? What are kind of like some of the key industries or sectors where you see the most promise, the most opportunity for ASEAN as a group or for individual countries?
Well, I think you need to kind of project the future. And the future is technology driven. So you have to believe that it's the digital space. It is the whole AI space that's going to grow exponentially.
Right.
And I think derivative of that are very important areas where ASEAN can brings where there are huge opportunities. For instance, energy.
Right.
And one of Malaysia's priority is to really move forwards with the ASEAN grid project, and that's huge. That's something like 1 to 2 trillion in terms of investment over the next 10, 15 years.
And this is to build a smart grid that exists across ASEAN.
Yeah, it is to connect our grids.
Right.
So there are 18 projects that have been identified. For instance, undersea cable from Vietnam to East Malaysia, from Indonesia through to Peninsular Malaysia, and so on. So that's huge. I think there's also cooperation projects in the space of water, and so infrastructure, derivative of this anticipated huge growth in technology, and what needs to drive technology is I think a key.
Right. And as you mentioned before, the priority of climate change and the need really to come up with new solutions to manage resource issues, which are often cross-border, especially when it comes to water, but also I think there's a lot to unlock in the energy space in terms of clean energy development in ASEAN and Southeast Asia. But perhaps the first step is, to get the connectivity together.
Yeah, you've got to get the connectivity together, but you also have to, keep reminding yourselves of the principle of sustainability, and there's a danger there because the shortages are very real,
right.
And the temptation is to ignore those issues. I mean, if you look at, for instance, some of the EV projects, right? What is powering the EV projects? That
coal
kind
sometimes,
of,
right?
That kind of worries you.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And I think this is a major challenge for addressing some systemic global issues, whether it's trade or in the climate space or even in security. There are investments that countries could be making right now that would set themselves up for a more long-term sustainable future, but could cause disruptions in the present. And oftentimes, political incentives drive more towards the short term rather than the long term. When I'm sure you're around the region, you're talking to business people, you're talking to policymakers. How are they viewing these types of challenges? Is it simply, we can't do this because of the political economy? Or do you think there's some creative thinking emerging about how to invest now for future sustainability and productivity?
Well, I think the government's playing a very important role. Malaysia has the the National Energy Transition Roadmap, for instance. And it's very important that governments have these kind of navigational constellations, if you like, for the industries. So having that, and then after that, putting in place the necessary regulation and incentives is important. And I think there's also a role for the private sector to drive the private sector, if you like, itself. Under the ASEAN BAC, we have a project to evolve a common carbon framework for ASEAN, for instance. And this is nothing to do with governments, but we want a common carbon framework so that we in the region have our own definitions of carbon credits.
Right.
We in the region are able to trade credits between one another. And we also want to overcome the bottlenecks that is globally today in terms of defining carbon credits, because at the moment there's basically 2 organizations that do this, and that's not enough with everything that's going on in the world. So ASEAN, we're trying to get to get the private sector behind, and ASEAN we have to do it ourselves. Framework.
Right. Yeah. No, that sounds like a really worthwhile project. We do a lot of work here on carbon pricing and emissions trading systems. And we know that this is probably the best way to marry business objectives with climate objectives. Those types of projects.
You should come and help us then.
Absolutely, we will. We would love to. We'll talk about that later. And I really like this idea of a navigational constellation. That's a clean concept to show that governments can play a real leadership role in managing some of these challenges. And it's good. I'm sensing from your perspective that the governments and the private sector are talking to each other. They're communicating. They're trying to find that way for priorities on both sides to align. So,
but this positive. Is a global issue.
Sure.
And as I said, there is this perceived, at least, change in posture of the global leader.
Right.
So this is still playing out.
Right.
So I'm also pretty anxious about that.
Sure. Yeah, cautiously optimistic at best.
I'm anxious.
Okay.
I'm anxious because I think if the US really steps back and says there's no climate problem, I think that'll be a big problem across the world.
Right. I guess I take some solace from the fact that the U.S. Or any country can claim that there's no climate problem, and yet the effects of climate change are real. Yeah. Even here in the United States, the amount of natural disasters that we're seeing every year is ticking up. The weather has changed dramatically. So I think, again, there's the U.S. government always has room to adjust in a pretty flexible system when it meets a problem that doesn't fit a narrative that it's created. But maybe more immediate and challenging is the kind of unlocking of all of the U.S. petro resources, which will, of course, drive emissions here and in the world. So these are major challenges, and it's, I think, fair to be anxious.
If you remember, for the developing countries, we're like, you guys cut the trees first.
Right.
This whole, cross-border, this global kind of rebalancing based on kind of reparations from the past, for instance, is a very, very complex issue.
It is. Yeah. It is. It's a huge, huge challenge. You also mentioned earlier, artificial intelligence and all of the productivity, the kind of major changes it could unlock. It strikes me as well that there's some huge liabilities there in terms of workforce management, development, training, et cetera. How do you see, or what do you think about kind of empowering the next generation of workforce in Southeast Asia? What are kind of the key skills and competencies that need to be that people need to be educated on now in order to take part in a future technology-driven economy?
Yeah, I think on this, our message to our governments is actually, this kind of pace of technological change is an opportunity to leapfrog. I think, countries that get this right can really jump the country's league table, if you like. And one driver is talent. How do we get the right talents trained, but also retained within our system?
Right.
Because it's, training is one thing, but a lot of we've had this massive brain drain in Malaysia. We train people and then we lose them.
Yeah, they go elsewhere for opportunities.
Either to where they don't come back from their studies, or they rush to Singapore where the paycheck is bigger. On two scores there. And at ASEAN Park, this whole challenge, how are we looking at it? Well, we are just about to launch next week the AI Malaysia private sector platform.
Great.
And we have encouraged all other countries in ASEAN to also do the same. The idea is, look, this is the defining challenge of our generation and the defining opportunity of our generation. And the US and China are so way ahead. So how do we collaborate?
Right.
How do we collaborate amongst ourselves? And then how do we reach out to China and the US to see, how to maximize the opportunities for our region? So that's how we're playing it. And part of that equation is also how best to train our people. There's no point doing it just Malaysia, right? We should do it at an ASEAN level. I'm envisioning a sort of AI ASEAN Institute for training the best talents in this field.
A center of excellence for ASEANs.
And I'm also encouraging that we relook at the whole way universities operate, how we reconfigure lifelong learning capabilities at our universities and so on.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point on the university piece. I think there is this sense that you get all of your education by the time you're, 25 or 30, and then you're set for the rest of your life. But the pace of technological change demands now that even, my grandparents need to go back and learn skills that they didn't have before in order to stay connected in this world. So I think lifelong learning is going to be a very important principle in the 21st century.
Yeah, and I have not seen universities recalibrating.
Right.
Enough.
Yeah. Right.
So I think there's an opportunity there for many.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Maybe my final question to you would be, tell us, you are now working in private equity. We know that the ASEAN countries are some of the most economically dynamic countries in the world. If there's going to be an engine of global growth in the 21st century, it is Asia. How does the private equity fit into some of these bigger priorities that you have for ASEAN integration, and what's the space look like today?
So one of the reasons I went into private equity after my banking career was a sense that we need more capital in private markets, both venture and growth equity. Today, ASEAN has something like 0.5% of GDP in private market capital.
Wow.
When the right benchmark is about 1.5%.
Yeah.
So we're short roughly about $60 billion in capital in the private market. So a lot of need for it. And private equity has it's a much more effective multiplier for economic growth in public markets.
Right.
Yeah. So we need this. And today, one of the reasons why we're so behind is also because the markets are still quite fragmented. And the history or track record of ASEAN private equity hasn't been great.
Right.
So I'm quite focused on my private equity, Ikhlas, doing well despite. And at the same time, working through Ikhlas and the ASEAN platform to try and improve the operating conditions for private equity in general. One of the things is, for instance, ownership restrictions across ASEAN. I think that regional private equity should be classified as domestic when it comes to ownership identification across the region, for instance. That would help reduce the fragmentation.
Right.
We're also trying to introduce this whole notion of an ASEAN IPO prospectus, so that when you raise, when you bring companies private, you don't just tap capital from your domestic markets, but you can do it throughout the whole of ASEAN. So these are some of the things I'm pushing.
Yeah, so one is like creating the model of what good private equity looks like, and the other is to kind of push the reforms necessary for more people to join in that model. We are running out of time, but since I have a couple of minutes with you, tell us something that you have recently read, watched, or seen that has made a big impact on you and your thinking.
You always...
I know. I always save the hardest questions for last. I know.
But actually, I just saw this Netflix documentary called Turning Point.
Okay, tell us about it.
And that's about the Vietnam War. And it reminds me, it took me back to that era.
Right.
Especially here in the United States, the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And, there was a lady there that said, my youth was about digesting the assassination of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy in the space of a few years.
Right. It's a time of incredible social turmoil in the United States.
Exactly. So then when you think about today, maybe, we shouldn't get too worried about what's happening today. There have been much tougher periods in history.
Yeah, I think this period today is a real challenge, in part because of the digital environment we're operating in and the kind of exposure to a lot of the benefits, but also the risks of globalization. But it is important to remember that social cohesion rises and falls in a democracy, and of course we can always bring it back together. So thank you for recommending Turning Point. I hope everybody gets a chance to check that out, to please have a look at Mr. Razak's book, What's in a Name. And thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.